I often think with true emotion about the treasures the composers left for us, perhaps not aware that we will cherish them so many centuries later as our present time treasure. Besides today's music's treasures, probably it's the first time since a century that, so to say, music explores the music of the past periods away from its context. And in the past, the music was the music of the present mostly, quasi-solely. And that moves me a lot because I always wonder how would it have been to have an older Schubert sonata, a later Chopin piece. These composers like Mendelssohn and Lili Boulanger, who Weber as well, who left us in their early age, not to mention Mozart. Of course, because we have plethora of so much of their production, we shouldn't be expecting for more. But since some of them did evolve in a way that we could foresee how they would have overlapped had they survived longer with some trends that others overtook. And there is this overlapping between late Brahms and early Debussy in chronology, not that they met. But there is also Poulenc, who attended a concert of a Boulez sonata. That's also a clash in styles. And perhaps in disbelief, in that case of Poulenc, for where atonal music can go. And within the realm of the tonal music, the styles evolving so fast, the instruments evolving so fast between the 18th and the 20th century, how would have they composed the Schumann, the Mendelssohn on a modern piano with a middle pedal that can hold even more compartmenting? Of course, they didn't shy of writing things that we wonder when we teach them, let's play them. How are we going to handle them when they're meant to have held sounds over moving other sounds without becoming blurry? As if there were three-handed pianists or instruments that could layer the holding like in an organ, but for the piano. And so perhaps the idiom, the language would have evolved not only compared to the tonal exercise of their expression as a mode of communicating their thoughts and feelings, but also the format and the acoustics and the determination of what is virtuosity. And they probably would have been surprised to see today so many music-making institutions who prepare students to be very early, well-armed professionals in performance or separately composition or separately musicology, separately whichever form of music making, not to mention imagining how interpretation was dislocated from composition, since it becomes its own work over the work, which I think is fantastic because it gives us the embarrassment of riches today to compare interpretations of past recorded and present artists, revisiting and constantly enlightening us with how they revisit the meaning of a piece, the meaning of a pulse, of a phrase, of a sentence. And I find it very touching when we can hear some old rolls or some early recordings from the very early 20th century, where beyond the crackling noise of the background of the technology for capturing the sound, we can hear the articulation and the clarity, the drive, the life, captured life. It's not still nature, it's really nature at life, and the music is notated and then comes to life when we play it. And of course, I wonder to which extent we do it justice when we try to imagine what the composer wanted. Because to a certain extent, the piece has its own autonomy of life, which becomes meaningful to each of us way beyond the composer. And there isn't necessarily a single truth about interpretation. If not, everybody would play alike. And even the composers that are very picky with their notation, like Beethoven, leave grace notes that are unmeasured up to the performer. And the little spaces for cadential improvisation, even in Haydn sonatas, fermata chords, today is a tradition that is no more occurring because editions, competitions, schools has formatted a certain way of playing things that doesn't imply improvising within the interpretational tools, other than voicing, coloring, perhaps rubato delaying a specific note in the elements that we have within the notes and the pitches and the rhythms that the composer defined on the score. But as always, there is the law and the spirit of the law and the interpretation of what we think it's meant to be, from a meter to a tempo marking, from a purposely contradictory indication of allegro ma non troppo, lively but not too much, or etwas langsamer, somewhat slower. Even that brings us to rethink how are we going to approach what it means to us. It's like as if each of us has an individual approach to this universal language through the specific genre styles which we serve and which are outside of their own context of war times or of revolutions or of tumultuous times, nobody choosing when they're alive. But somehow I dream to imagine a later Chopin work. That's true. And what would have been a Schubert later work? Would have he kept the formal sonata form, or would have he broken with the rigid rules of it? And they were not rigid, since there were the rules, and he expressed his melodic and harmonic expression through it. In other words, it's not all about. Some composers like Beethoven, Stravinsky felt, and some others, the need to, Scriabin, evolve in their music language, search more the meaning of what is their calling from inside out. When we play their music, we come from outside in, their thoughts, souls, imagination, and we identify with them to the point to which we think that we become them. During the performance, it's not about ego problem or trip. It's about immersing ourselves through the tools of their expression in the essence of what they wanted to suggest, in absence of a coordination with lyrics, which in certain ways explain what the gestures, the intervals in the melodic line say. But when you're left with the melodic line itself without lyrics, then it's an incredible open world to inner fantasy, inner storytelling, either narrative, the narrative that becomes ours while it's theirs. And it would have been so wonderful to have had seen the evolution. If a late Chopin wrote music, he would have overlapped with Brahms as towards the end of the 19th century. If a late Schubert he would have overlapped with Brahms. And how that would have affected if they were aware of it. We have the example of Haydn dying in 1809, who saw a lot of Beethoven's development as well as Mozart's interrupted trajectory of the meteorite that he was. It must have puzzled him too, because somehow music evolves in ways away from academic ways. Same thing could have been said for Saint-Saëns Fauré compared to the music written after the World War II. And is there so much difference than that, after all, between the stylistic evolution, or at least changes, because I don't think they considered them evolution. They only were in their own time period. We consider it perhaps like this, I do, but that doesn't matter. What matters is how meaningful it is to us to immerse ourselves in their aesthetics, in their music worlds, in their imagination, in their dreams and hopes, their elevation of spirit through their religion or their humanity, as expectation of music breaking some barriers of social levels that were breaking down society. I don't think they were socially so aware than that. They were mostly obviously aware of it by living it, but also because they had to survive it. And so much production had to be made, since you couldn't conserve music in recorded format. Therefore, new music had to be written constantly to a certain extent. That could be our luxury today in some circles where we have the time to really live in depth the music that it took them few minutes to throw on the paper, and which was a representation of their inner world and how they perceived the world around them, and how much more we take time to decipher beyond the notes the intent, and beyond the intent the purpose, other than just being marveled by the way they tell us the story, and how sometimes we are puzzled where they go or bring us, and how they develop or interrupt it or fragment it or over-variate it. It's just it's a trip within their thought process. All that to play their music to the closest meaning to us. And of course, we have the trends and the obligations to match the expectation, because people play certain tempi, and then if somebody plays slower, it's eccentric. If it's played too fast, it'll be considered show-off. Who defines all these rules is a question that remains open, but you have to find the cohesion, the coherence of your own choices that come from what you heard or taught or reject or filtered, and ultimately imagine. That's why I sometimes divagate when I get myself to play pieces, continuing them, imagining how they would have evolved had they not stopped in that bar. And that's very liberating, I must say. Not that one feels constrained within their notes, though we are so afraid to betray them by misplaying the notes, but to enter in an escapism for us in another dimension during the time we work on a section of a piece, even if it's for technical purposes, disconnected from the emotional involvement and the transmission with the audience, just to shape best the transition between this and the second theme, and how we're going to bring it best to merge in traffic, to have this new theme come naturally as we think it should be at its best. And all what we planned because we analyzed or heard it and love it because we just are enamored with it. We want to share this connection first with the piece itself, by itself, for itself. It's a language by its own in which we enter in communication with our own yearning to find how to dig the best out of ourselves while serving the muse. But it is true that music was a lot improvisatory and spontaneous even in the past, and the notation froze it more or less to the point to which it was supposed to be, with room for different ways when played through. And the question is where and what and when, and who defines a good taste of it, since we are outside of that time period where it was the fashion of the place, the trend of the way people approach these things. But since most of the time people played their own music, or music of their own time, by colleagues who played them, the communality of the music language, while the individuality of the artistic expression, it's extremely moving to imagine how they shared, compared, judged, disliked or liked pieces of each other. But there was a deep sense of comprehension because they shared a common alphabet in a sort, with alterations and with ways of breaking a certain trend to create their own, either or just flow on the existing one and insert themselves in this tradition without even question. Now that classical, as we call it, music, even if it englobes way more styles than this, but a genre rather than a style, reflective music, absolute music, even when it's without lyrics, and we are there to express it. The students who arrive to study, they come from so many more continents than they did in the time of the composition of the music. And they bring in an understanding and a hearing which opens the horizons. And it's not in major ways, it's in little things that you sense the lightness, the weight, the staccato between a, say, wet staccato, a dry staccato, a mezzo staccato, and without the implication of a mood, only the length of the value. But sometimes it implies this, or perhaps they manage to keep a little bit of distance with what it implies. Or then they see something else in it. The opening of Waldstein is played common staccato. There is no marking for that. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't. Of course, the sounds of the decay of the instruments of the past were shorter, but played on the modern piano staccato, it becomes a funny, if not spirited opening. And if you do it with connecting the chords by replaying them, lifting the keys, then you have a continuum, more as a vibrato resonance on a single tone, sort of a bebung, but not fast repeated. So it's a loss in translation through the instrument, the technique, the way of applying the hearing, and how we project for how, with whom, for where, when we play in a hall where we captured on the mic from close up, there is a sense of presence in the recorded music that is perhaps overwhelming. And if the pedaling is dry or less wet, then we hear more of the inner voices. And but some aesthetics would find it too dry, some too wet. And they used to be, until World War II at least, defined piano techniques, approach of the sound, of the tone in general, and not only in particular styles like the Russian technique with the magnetic closed fingers to the keys, in all circumstances, legata, even in staccata, and the French pearled playing, or jeu perlé, of course, even mentioning these specific ways, it sounds a little bit schematic, but it has its virtue of defining, and the German extraction of the tone, and perhaps a way of playing the sounds without too much pedal. And the pedal being a harmonic device on the piano, when you have a single keyboard, inevitably it implies interference with the melodic lines wherever they are placed in the texture. So you have to have a tolerance for harmonic combinations with melodic overlappings or smearings that could be intolerable to some and too dry to others. And then it's a question of how we cleanse our ears to hear the music down up from the harmonic to the melodic, or from the melodic into the harmonic, and accept the combination of the resonances. Then it depends on the subtlety of the touch and how subtle the dynamics can be from mezzo pianissimo to mezzo piano, and we have not need to go from piano to forte if we bring this. But still, the essence of it is what we hear when we read, and how we translate through our fingers, and how much they betray our reading, or how much our reading betrays our understanding of the intent of the composer, and then the interpretation. It would have been so nice, beyond having them write longer and more pieces, the composers we love to play, or we struggle to play well all our life long, so much they packaged of their intent in our lives to discover we won't have enough of a life for each of the pieces that we want to serve. So it's a gift that keeps on giving. But ultimately, we would have liked to also converse with them. I have so many questions for so many of the composers. As a performer, obviously, all of us do, but also as a teacher, because I find that there are certain things that are left there in the notation that, regardless how many published editions you compare, regardless even if you have access to an existing original handwriting of the composer, there are always little things between the notes that I'd like to clarify, because there are ways to do it that gives it a meaning, and the composer is not supposed to follow our logic that tries to follow theirs. Patterns or not, modulations or coloring by the modulation or by the tuning or by the voicing or by the second voicing, and the breathing, the phrasing, the arching, the statement that they had in mind. I would like to imagine that they find that as a teacher, we do our best to bring them to the next generation, people who will in turn cherish them, teach them, and try to answer the unanswerable questions. But in the process, it brings so much meaning to their lives, as it does to mine. Thank you.